The Berlin Blockade and the Deutschmark Potsdam's chickens have come home to roost. Winston Churchill, the former wartime British Prime Minister, delivered a speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, on March 5, 1946. The speech is most notable for coining the term Iron Curtain to describe the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, and it is often cited as the Western acknowledgement of the start of the Cold War. The term Iron Curtain remained in use throughout the Cold War, which lasted until the dissolution of the Soviet Union on December 26, 1991, ultimately ending the East-West standoff between former wartime allies. However, the speech itself was not a significant act in the Cold War beyond introducing a phrase that encapsulated the situation in Europe. The first major event of the Cold War was the Berlin Blockade, which began on June 24, 1948. The United States, Soviet Union, and United Kingdom agreed at the Potsdam Conference, held from July 17 to August 2, 1945, to divide Germany and its capital, Berlin, into occupation zones. The US, UK, USSR, and France would each govern a specific zone of occupied Germany and Berlin. Berlin's location, approximately 100 miles, 160 kilometers, within the Soviet occupation zone, posed a significant issue for the Western Allies. This situation meant that the Western Allies would need to rely on truck and rail to supply not only their occupation forces in the city, but also to support the German population in their respective zones. In response, the Soviet Union's dictator, Joseph Stalin, decided to block the Western Allies' land routes to Berlin, aiming to pressure them into abandoning the city and ceding control to the Soviet Union. Like many events of the Cold War, the decisions driven by ideology and mistrust were the results of an ongoing action-reaction cycle. The Soviet decision to blockade Berlin was part of this cycle, rather than a simple choice made by Stalin in June 1948 to push his former wartime allies out of the city. This blockade stemmed from a fundamental disagreement over competing visions for the future of post-war Germany. Despite reaching agreements, the divide between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union strained the Potsdam Conference. While the countries agreed on the division and occupation of Germany, they did not reach a consensus on its future. The West, led by the United States, aimed for a democratic and robust German state. Consequently, between 1948 and 1952, the US provided $1.5 billion through the Marshall Plan. This aid was intended to support post-war reconstruction, including industrial development, food assistance in Germany, and the resettlement of 8 million refugees, including 3 million from East Germany. The Soviet Union, in contrast, aimed for a weak Germany. It was actively stripping wealth from its occupied zones and shipping those resources back to the Soviet Union as a form of reparations. This approach also denied Eastern Germans the opportunity and ability to rebuild their country. Consequently, the Soviet Union prevented Marshall Plan aid from reaching East Germany. The Soviets believed their occupation objectives were justified, having been invaded by Germany twice, in 1914 and 1941, during both World Wars, resulting in approximately 2 million deaths in World War I and 27 million in World War II. Keeping Germany weak was a defense priority for Joseph Stalin, so the Western occupation objectives were fundamentally incompatible with Soviet aims. The Soviets became vocally suspicious when the US and UK combined their occupation zones in 1947, with this integration taking effect in 1948. The French integrated their zone in 1949. The Soviets viewed this as an attempt by the Western Allies to establish a new West German state. Although the Western Allies did approach the Soviets about reunification, they could not agree on terms, as both sides had different objectives for the future of Germany, shaped by their distinct occupation goals. The Soviets' response was actions to weaken all of Germany by manipulating the German currency. All the post-war German occupation zones, both Western and Soviet, utilized a common currency, the Reichsmark, which had been in circulation in Germany since the 1920s. The Soviets, aiming to weaken occupied Germany, decided to take measures to debase the Reichsmark. Their primary strategy involved excessively printing and circulating the currency, leading to rampant inflation. Throughout 1948, Soviet efforts intensified as German GDP inflation surged from 6.3% in 1947 to 15.3% in 1948, which devalued the savings in Germany and diminished purchasing power in an economy striving to recover in the West. This situation also fueled the growth of the illicit black market across Germany. Furthermore, these actions created societal pressures in Western Germany, potentially leading to social unrest that Soviet communists could exploit against the West. The Soviet action worked against Western objectives to rebuild Western Germany. The Soviets' intentional inflationary policy in Germany, through the artificial manipulation of the Reichsmark, was undermining Western efforts to rebuild West Germany. However, as long as there was a common currency used in both Western and Soviet occupation zones, the West had limited options to counteract Soviet actions and the economic instability they were creating. The West recognized that a thriving black market and societal unrest could derail their objectives for occupation and reconstruction in Germany. In response to Soviet opposition to their plans for Western Germany and currency manipulation, the West decided to introduce a new currency in their occupation zones, the Deutschmark. This move incited Soviet ire. The decision to pursue currency reform was made prior to the significant inflation increase of 1948, with work on the reform beginning as early as October 1947. The initiative to expedite currency reform and introduce the Deutschmark commenced in April 1948 in Kassel, Germany. There, German economists, guided by American advisors, developed the laws and processes for implementing a new currency during closed meetings that continued until June 8, 1948. 10 days later, on June 18, 1948, the Western Allies announced that the Deutschmark would replace the Reichsmark in the Western occupation zones, including Berlin, effective June 21, 1948. The implementation of the Deutschmark would eliminate the Soviets' ability to easily pursue their inflationary policies in Germany. More importantly, the introduction of the Deutschmark, supported by Western and particularly American aid, would contribute to rebuilding a strong West Germany by providing economic stability, thus enabling reconstruction efforts to proceed without the hindrance of rampant inflation. This change would also help keep society stable and make it harder for the Soviets to use social unrest to keep Germany weak. Additionally, it represented an important step toward the establishment of a new German nation in the West. This was not, however, the main justification for the Deutschmark's introduction. Anticipating a Soviet reaction, the West sent 2.5 million Deutschmarks to Berlin as the new currency for West Berlin prior to June 21. The Soviet reaction was swift, but not entirely unexpected. The Soviets chose to implement their land blockade of Berlin, citing the introduction of the Deutschmark and Western policies in Germany that contradicted post-war agreements as the rationale for the Berlin Blockade. While these factors may have acted as catalysts, the underlying issue was that the Soviets and the West never reached a consensus at Potsdam regarding the goals of German occupation. The actions and reactions stemming from this fundamental gap in unified objectives ultimately led to the decision to blockade Berlin. Distrust between the West and the Soviets predated World War II, making it almost inevitable that once the existential threat of Nazi Germany was eliminated, that distrust would resurface, especially exacerbated by Soviet aims to prevent another German invasion of their territory. This historical distrust indicated that any hope for a unified agreement by the West and the Soviets at Potsdam was a naive folly. The Soviets seemed aware of the situation while the West clung to optimism. By 1946, as Churchill remarked during a speech at a small college in Missouri, such wishful Western thinking from 1945 was destined for failure. The Cold War would have ignited elsewhere in occupied Europe if it hadn't started in Berlin.